Let's get right into it. Number 10. The S-13 submarine and the ice true. You've probably seen a movie where a submarine is trapped under a thick sheet of ice, and the crew has to find a way to escape before they run out of oxygen. That's a classic for a reason. It's terrifying. Now imagine that happening in real life, but the crew isn't just trapped. They're sitting on the bottom of the ocean floor, having just been struck by a rogue iceberg, and they're waiting for a rescue that may never come. This is exactly what happened to the Soviet submarine S-13 in 1957. A sudden massive ice flow, which their sonar had somehow missed, struck the sub and pushed it down over 1,000 feet to the seabed. The impact was so jarring it knocked out their power and damaged their hull. What followed was a claustrophobic nightmare. For nearly 2 days, the 30-man crew sat in total darkness, breathing recycled air, with the pressure of the entire Arctic Ocean pressing in on them. Every creak of the hull was a reminder that they were essentially in a steel coffin. They had no idea if the world above even knew they were there. With the oxygen dwindling and temperatures dropping to near freezing, the men started to accept their fate. Then, in an almost impossible stroke of luck, a Soviet surface ship conducting an unrelated survey detected the silent sub on its sonar. The crew managed to get a tow line attached, and the ship slowly dragged the S-13 back to the surface. Against all odds, every single man survived. It's a story of survival that feels less like a triumph of human ingenuity and more like a cosmic roll of the dice, where they just happened to win. It proves that sometimes the most terrifying part of a survival scenario isn't the threat itself, but the agonizing, creeping wait for death that may or may not come. Number 9. The lost cabin in the snow. Imagine you're a trapper in the Canadian wilderness, far from any town, with nothing but a rifle and your wits. You have a cabin stocked with supplies for the winter, and you've been out on your trapline for a few days when a freak blizzard hits. It's a whiteout. You can't see more than a few feet in front of you. You make your way back, but when you get to where your cabin should be, it's gone. Covered by a monumental snowdrift, so completely buried that there's no trace of it. This isn't some campfire story. It's what happened to a real trapper named Harry Liddell in the 1920s. For over a month, Liddell was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with temperatures plunging to 50 below zero. He had no shelter, no food, and no heat beyond what he could get from small fires made with whatever scraps of wood he could find. He built a temporary shelter out of snow and pine boughs, but it was barely enough to keep him from freezing to death. His supplies ran out in days, and he was forced to eat whatever he could scavenge: tree bark, frozen berries he dug out from under the snow, and a few small animals he managed to trap with snares made from his shoelaces. The real horror wasn't the cold or the starvation, but the complete and utter psychological breakdown that happens when you realize you're alone in an endless white nothing, and your home, your only hope, has been swallowed by the earth. Liddell was found by a passing fur buyer, nearly dead from starvation and frostbite, a little over a month after the blizzard. He was so disoriented he could barely speak, but he was alive. It's a reminder that sometimes the most valuable survival tool you have isn't a knife or a fire starter. It's the will to not completely lose your mind when all hope seems lost. Number 8. The man who woke up in a freezer. This one sounds like a bad horror movie, but it's a very real and very disturbing historical footnote. Imagine you're a slaughterhouse worker in the 1920s, and you're just finishing up your shift. You go into the massive meat locker to do a final check, and someone, a colleague you thought was gone for the day, slams the heavy steel door shut behind you and locks it. You're trapped. This is what happened to a man named David Tork in Chicago. He was locked in a freezer and left for dead. Now, these aren't your average walk-in coolers. These are industrial-sized freezers meant to keep hundreds of pounds of meat frozen solid for weeks. The temperature was well below freezing, and the air was thick with the chilling fog of cold. He had no way to call for help, and the thick, insulated walls meant no one could hear his frantic banging. The initial panic must have been absolute terror. As the cold started to set in, the horror shifted from the external threat of being locked in to the internal, slow march toward death. Frostbite would have set in almost immediately, starting with his fingers and toes, a creeping, numb agony. His body would have begun shutting down, a process called hypothermia, where your brain starts to malfunction and you lose the ability to think clearly. Tork had less than 24 hours before the slaughterhouse would open again, and his body was failing him fast. In a desperate final attempt to survive, he grabbed a large frozen side of beef and began to use it as a battering ram, slamming it against the steel door. He did this for hours, even as his strength faded and his body threatened to give up. The next morning, a co-worker heard the faint, repetitive thudding from inside the freezer and opened the door. Tork was found barely conscious, with severe frostbite and injuries from his desperate last-ditch effort, but he was alive. It's a testament to the fact that when you're facing certain death, your brain doesn't always give you a choice. It just forces you to keep going, even when your body is screaming at you to stop. Number 7. The family trapped in a well. A well is a hole in the ground, usually filled with water that seems innocent enough. But what if that well was your prison? This isn't a hypothetical question for a family of 4 in rural India who in the 1950s were forced to hide from a rampaging tiger that had been terrorizing their village. They sought refuge in an old abandoned well, thinking it was a safe place to wait out the beast. The tiger, however, was far from gone. It stalked them to the well, and they realized they were trapped. Now imagine this horrifying scenario. You're at the bottom of a deep, dark pit with no way to climb out, and a huge predator is pacing at the top, a shadow against the daylight, its roars echoing down the shaft. For 2 days, the family sat in the dark, with the constant threat of the tiger looming over them. The well was bone dry, but the air was stale and heavy. They had no food, no water, and no way to signal for help. The father, a man named Ram Singh, had the terrible realization that the tiger wasn't leaving. It had decided they were a meal it would eventually get to eat. He knew that their only chance was to make a run for it. On the 3rd night, under the cover of darkness, Ram Singh climbed out of the well, knowing he would be an immediate target. He used himself as a decoy. And miraculously, the tiger, distracted by his movements, didn't notice as the rest of the family, his wife and 2 young children, scrambled out and ran to safety. He managed to escape the tiger as well, but his bravery in the face of a terrifying predator saved his entire family. This story isn't just about surviving an animal attack. It's a chilling reminder of the primal fear of being hunted and the lengths a human will go to protect the people they love. Number 6. The human hibernation experiment. You know how bears hibernate through the winter, slowing their heart rate and metabolism to a crawl? It sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, but for one man in 1960s Russia, it was a terrifyingly real experience. Ivan Dushkov was an amateur mountaineer who got caught in a sudden brutal blizzard in the Ural Mountains. He was miles from his camp and completely disoriented. With no chance of making it back and hypothermia setting in fast, he did something radical. He remembered reading an old folk tale about a Russian hermit who survived a freezing winter by burying himself in a pile of leaves and snow. Ivan decided to try the same thing. He dug a small hole under the thick roots of a pine tree, insulated it with as many pine needles and dead leaves as he could find, and curled up inside, letting the snow cover him completely. He essentially put himself into a state of voluntary hibernation. For 3 days and 3 nights, he lay in that tiny snow cave, not moving, barely breathing, his body temperature dropping dangerously low. His metabolism slowed so much that he slipped into a semi-conscious state, like a deep frozen sleep. He wasn't dead, but he was barely alive. The real horror of this wasn't the cold itself, but the surreal experience of his mind during this state. He reported later that he had vivid, hallucinatory dreams, where he was a ghost floating over the mountains, watching his own frozen body below. He described it as a feeling of being both completely dead and completely alive at the same time. He was eventually found by a search party who initially thought he was a frozen corpse. He was rushed to a hospital, and it took days for him to recover, but he had survived. This story is a bizarre look into the human body's last-ditch effort to survive when all other options have run out. It's like your biology hits an emergency button, and you just become a really, really slow-moving battery. Number 5. The man who survived on a diet of snow and raw mice. The human body can survive for a few weeks without food, but only a few days without water. So what happens when you have plenty of water but absolutely no food, and you're trapped in the middle of a sub-zero winter? You get the terrifying story of Aron Ralston, but with way more mice. In the 1970s, a man named Sergei Balikov was a geophysicist doing research in Siberia when his truck broke down in a remote mountainous region. With no communication and no one knowing where he was, he had to survive. He had no food, but he had a way to get water, by melting snow. For 2 months, his only source of sustenance was melted snow and whatever he could catch. And in the middle of a Siberian winter, that wasn't much. So he learned to become a hunter. His diet consisted of raw mice that he managed to trap by building rudimentary snares out of thin wire. The mice were frozen solid, and he had to eat them raw, just as they were. His body was pushed to its absolute breaking point. He lost over 80 pounds, and his body was so starved of nutrients that he started experiencing severe cognitive and physical decline. He had hallucinations, his eyesight started to fail, and he could barely move. The real psychological torment wasn't just the hunger, but the moral dilemma he faced every day. He was a vegetarian, a man who never ate meat, and now he was forced to eat raw mice to stay alive. The experience completely broke him, but it also kept him alive. He was eventually found by a helicopter, a ghost of his former self. His survival is a brutal reminder that a survival story isn't always about a heroic act of strength. Sometimes it's about making a series of horrific compromises with yourself until you're a shell of who you used to be. Number 4. The Lake Nyos disaster. Imagine waking up one morning and finding that everyone around you is dead. Not from an attack or a disease, but from the air itself. This isn't a post-apocalyptic movie. It's what happened in 1986 in a remote region of Cameroon. Lake Nyos is a volcanic crater lake, and for years it had a silent, invisible killer lurking beneath its surface. The lake was sitting on top of a pocket of magma, which was constantly releasing carbon dioxide, CO2, into the water. This CO2, being heavier than air, stayed trapped at the bottom of the lake under immense pressure. One day, for reasons scientists still can't fully agree on, the lake belched. All that trapped CO2 was released in a single massive cloud. The cloud, a silent, odorless killer, rolled down the surrounding hills at nearly 50 miles per hour, suffocating everything in its path. Over 1,700 people and 3,500 livestock died in their sleep, their lungs filled with the gas. The victims didn't even have time to scream. The only survivors were those who were on higher ground, a few lucky individuals who were upwind from the cloud, and a handful of people who woke up in time to get to safety, only to return and find a nightmare. This is the story of Joseph Nkwine, a man who woke up to find his entire village silent, his family, his friends, his neighbors, all dead. He walked through a ghost town, with the corpses of animals and people lying in the street, their faces peaceful, as if they were just sleeping. Joseph was one of the few who survived because he was in a house on a slightly higher elevation, and the CO2 cloud, which was heavier than air, had mostly settled in the valleys below. The psychological torment of being one of the only people left in a community that had been wiped out overnight is unimaginable. This is a story of survival, not against a visible enemy or a natural disaster, but against a completely invisible and almost magical force of death. It's a terrifying reminder that some of the greatest dangers in the world aren't things you can see or hear. They're the silent, invisible truths of the world that you're just not aware of. Number 3. The Last Man on the Lifeboat. The ocean is terrifying for a lot of reasons, but one of the creepiest is the psychological breakdown that comes with being completely alone on it. The story of Poon Lim is one of the most famous survival stories in history, and it's also one of the most psychologically brutal. Poon Lim was a Chinese sailor who, in 1942, was on a British merchant ship that was torpedoed by a German U-boat. He managed to grab a life vest and a few scraps of wood and was the only person to survive the sinking. He spent 133 days alone on a life raft, longer than any other person in history. He was completely alone, with no one to talk to, no one to share the burden with, and no one to confirm that what he was seeing was real. The first few days were a struggle for survival, but as time went on, the real danger wasn't the sharks circling his raft or the lack of food. It was the crushing, soul-crushing loneliness. He started to talk to himself, creating imaginary friends out of the seagulls that landed on his raft. He'd spend hours having conversations with them, trying to hold on to his sanity. He was constantly battling the urge to just give up and let the ocean take him. The physical toll was immense. He had to catch fish with makeshift hooks and collect rainwater, but the mental toll was what truly tested him. He was a man completely adrift, in a literal and metaphorical sense. He was eventually found by fishermen off the coast of Brazil, a skeletal figure who could barely stand. He had survived, but he was a different man. The story of Poon Lim is a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest enemy in a survival situation isn't nature or a predator. It's your own mind, slowly unraveling in the face of absolute isolation. Number 2, the hiker who forgot his own identity. Imagine you're out for a hike, enjoying the fresh air and the quiet of nature, but then you get lost. Not just a little bit lost, but completely, totally lost. You wander for days with no food, no water, and no idea where you are. The physical toll would be immense, but the psychological toll would be far worse. This is the story of a man in the 1960s named Richard Hall, who went hiking in the Olympic National Park in Washington. He got lost, and for 22 days, he was completely missing. When a search party finally found him, they didn't find the man they were looking for. They found a man who had completely forgotten who he was. The trauma of the experience had caused him to suffer from what's known as dissociative fugue, a rare psychological state where a person forgets their identity and past. He was a complete blank slate. He didn't know his name, where he was from, or how he ended up in the woods. His mind, in an act of what can only be described as a self-defense mechanism, had completely erased the traumatic experience and everything that came before it. He was a survivor, but at the cost of his own identity. The medical team had to use old photos and news reports to help him piece together his life, but he never fully recovered his memories of the time before he went missing. This story is a deeply disturbing look at the mind's ability to protect itself from trauma. It's like your brain is a computer that, when faced with an existential threat, decides to wipe the hard drive clean, instead of dealing with the corruption. The man survived, but the person he was before the hike was gone forever. Number 1. The Trapped Cava. You've probably heard of the infamous story of Nutty Putty Cave, but this one is even more chilling because it involves an unimaginable choice. A caver named David Leung was exploring a remote cave system in Australia when he got stuck in a small, tight passage known as the Devil's Elbow. He was wedged in so tightly that he couldn't move forward or backward. He was in a horizontal position on his stomach with his arms pinned against his sides. The darkness was absolute, and the silence was deafening. He was completely alone, and no one knew where he was. As the hours turned into a day, and then a day turned into 2, the terror of his situation slowly gave way to a different kind of horror. He had enough water to last him for a while, but he had no food, and his body was being crushed by the narrow passage. But the most terrifying part wasn't the physical pain or the loneliness. It was the realization that he was in a spot where no rescue team could get to him. He was in an unmapped part of the cave system, and any attempt to widen the passage would risk causing a cave-in, burying him alive. After nearly 72 hours of being trapped, David made a choice that is almost impossible to comprehend. He decided to let himself die. He knew there was no way out, and he didn't want to die slowly from dehydration or starvation, so he made the decision to take his own life. But he couldn't. He couldn't move his arms or his body. He was completely, utterly helpless. He was a man who had chosen death over a slow, agonizing demise, only to find that even that choice was taken from him. He was finally found by a fellow caver who happened to be exploring a different part of the system. David was barely conscious, and it took a team of professionals over 12 hours to pull him out, bit by bit. He survived, but the psychological scars of that experience are something he will carry forever. It's a terrifying story that reveals the ultimate paradox of survival. Sometimes when you're faced with an unimaginable horror, the choice to live isn't even your own. That's all for today. I'll be making similar videos in the future. Subscribe to see them.